There you go. I'll call to order the August 14th meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak to anything not on our agenda? Seeing no one, we'll go to the first and only item on our agenda, which is a response to the grand jury report. Mr. Samario?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Bob Samario, Finance Director. So, we're here to present to you our proposed responses to a grand jury report, and I'll get into some of the details. We're coming to you for your comment, and then we're going to be at City Council on September 11th. It's going to be a consent item, unless we feel like we need to spend more time with full council on this. But that's our goal. So I just wanted to present it to you and get your feedback and recommendations, hopefully to council, that you support these proposed responses. So just by way of background, the City of Santa Barbara offers what's called a defined benefit retirement plan, which means that we guarantee a benefit based on years of service and other formulaic components. This CalPERS is the biggest, or I should say CalPERS administers the city's pension plan. It does the same for basically all cities, or almost all cities in the state. Most counties, there are some counties that have their own pension plan, like the County of Santa Barbara under the 1937 Act. But the state of California is part of the PERS system, and they are the largest pension system in the world. They currently have somewhere around $350 billion of assets accumulated for the future payment of benefits, or current payments of benefits as well. So over the last decade, as I'm sure you know, public employee pensions have received a great deal of attention nationwide. And even before the Great Recession of 2008, there was the criticism of the fact that PERS was using what some believe to be an unreasonable discount rate. That's the rate that they use and assume in terms of what they're going to earn on their investments. Back in the early 2000s, it was 7 3/4. So they assumed that on average every year they would earn 7 3/4 on their investments. And even back then, when plans were in the 70s and 80s percentage funded, there was criticism that they should be 100% funded. Personally, I didn't agree with those criticisms, because I think if you over a 30 or 40 year period, the returns that CalPERS has enjoyed has been in the 7.5% to 8% range, even through this current date, including the Great Recession. If you look at any 20 or 30 year period, CalPERS has earned on average closer to 8% than what people think should be more of a 6% number. And also at 80%, to criticize that, these things have been flowing. At one point we were super funded, so I think being at 80% in the early 2000s was not a bad place to be. But in any case, there has been this national attention, again, particularly because of the investment losses in 2008. CalPERS did sustain about a 24% loss in their assets. So at that point, they were in the low 300 billion range. They went almost down to 250. So a big hit for sure. But in any case, the Santa Barbara County Grand Jury received complaints about the 9 pension plans in the county. So there are 8 city plans plus the county's own plan. And as a result of that, they completed an analysis of those plans and developed a number of recommendations, or actually findings and recommendations. I, in fact, was part of that analysis, and they interviewed me and other finance directors in the county for some of our feedback. But they basically came up with 10 findings and 2 recommendations. There are more than that, but we were required to respond to items 3 through 10 because they affected us, as well as recommendations 1 and 2. And we are required to respond by September 18th. We have 90 days to respond from the June 18th date. Our response options, as they indicate, are to either agree with the findings and recommendations, disagree partially with an explanation, or disagree wholly with an explanation. So a quick summary of our responses, and I'll get into these in more detail. For findings 3 and 6, which are kind of related, we indicate that we disagree partially. And for finding 4, we proposed that we would disagree wholly. And then items 5 and then 7 through 10 we agree with. So we're going to spend our time and focus our attention on items 3, 6, and 4. So within those findings, there basically assessed 2 primary risks, and I'll define what they mean. But One is solvency risk and the other is liquidity risk. And the solvency risk relates to findings 3 and 6 and is based strictly on what they, as their measure or indicator, they looked at the funded ratio of the plans. And what that means is how much do we have in total assets accumulated at PERS with our plans versus what's our accrued liability. And that's just a simple formula of what the funded ratio is, and that's that 70%, 80% number we've been talking about. So they calculated the funded ratios across all the plans. It's actually a number provided in the valuation reports that PERS produces every year. And they basically determined that if you have a plan that's funded at less than 70%, then you are considered to be a high risk. And what the implication or what they're trying to suggest is that PERS, not the city, that the CalPERS plans and the system itself, because we're below 70%, is at high risk of going bankrupt or insolvent. It's a solvency risk, not with the city, but with the system itself, that they will run out of money in the future to not be able to pay benefits into the future or long term. It's a pretty big, thing to claim to the system, and that's why I brought up at the beginning that CalPERS is a big plan, big systems, $350 billion in assets, and to suggest that they will be bankrupt in the near future, not be able to pay benefits, is a big statement, in my opinion. So we disagree partially, believe it or not, with this finding, because we do agree that funded status of 70% or below that is not ideal. We would like to be higher than that, and I'll speak more to that. But we also just flat out don't agree that the plans are in jeopardy of insolvency. If you just, for example, if you were to continue to pay benefits for all retirees and future retirees and have no additional contributions from employers and employees, we would be able to make benefit payments for the next 15 years, just based on what's there today. So again, no contributions at all. We would be solvent for 15 years based on what our obligations are today for our plans. And certainly we're going to continue to make contributions, both from employer and employee perspective. So that's really primarily why we believe that to state that the plan is in high risk of becoming insolvent is probably, in our opinion, not true. We also believe that the use of a funded ratio, that should be rational, not ration, at a point in time as a basis for the conclusion is fairly flawed. It doesn't provide any context over the last 15 years, what's transpired. It just happens that we've gone through probably, the worst 15-year period in history. We had the recession of 2001, as that was impacted by the 9/11 event. And then we had in 2008 the Great Recession, the worst of its kind for 70 or 80 years. And so this has been a difficult time for us as a nation and economically. And the fact that we are close to 70% even today with all that is pretty remarkable. And I think that to point that out, that we're slightly below 70% today, and that as a basis to determine that we have a high risk of insolvency is a little unfair. It doesn't provide context or doesn't consider the context. We also we believe that their assessment and their finding doesn't take into consideration the recent actions that PERS has taken over the last several years to address the funded status. As you know, even before the change in the discount rate recently, PERS has made some changes that will help get us to a fully funded status. That was the whole plan initially a number of years ago that said over a 5-year period we're going to start raising rates to get to a fully funded status. And more recently they lowered the discount rate, not because they believe they're not going to be able to achieve that 7.5% or 8% per year that they've enjoyed over the last 30 or so years on average. They just are trying to eliminate the volatility in the future. And so what they're essentially done is they shifted the risk of volatility more to the employers and the employees rather than to themselves. So basically what the actions they've taken is to, in a sense, strengthen the risk or lower the risk of the plan itself by shifting it more to cities, but the plan itself, I think, is stronger because of those actions on the part of PERS, and will likely result in the near future of getting to a more fully funded status. And then the last thing our basis for our response is that the assessment does not factor the long-term benefits of PEPRA, which really reduced formulas, reduced our normal cost, and on a long-term basis will serve to get to a fully funded status or help. Any questions on any of that piece? Any comments on that? The other risk that they assessed was liquidity risk, and that's finding number 4. And what this speaks to now is the city. What they're suggesting is that the city is in high risk of not being able to fulfill its obligations, annual contribution requirements over the near term or long term. That at some point we're not going to be able to make those payments. And the basis for this conclusion is that they basically looked at what are going to be the projected pension costs over the next 7 or 8 years, and they made some assumptions of our revenue growth. They looked at historical averages, and they show a projected deficit for the next 8 years, negative cash flows or budget deficits based on those projections or their assumptions. Our response is we disagree wholly with this, not even partially. We wholly disagree that we are at high risk of not being able to fulfill our obligations to PERS. We historically have shown that we have a policy that says we're not going to adopt any deficit spending budgets. We're not going to look to pay for any of these things through reserves. We're going to maintain balanced budgets, and we do have a history of addressing and managing these big hits. We did that in 2009 after the 2008 recession. We had a $10 million hit. That was 10% of our budget, and we were able to manage to get through that successfully. And in fact, during that period, since that period, we were able to actually grow our reserves. And with this one, it's a known impact, and it's a future impact, and we will, my opinion, we're going to balance each year's budget through either cost containment cutting measures, or we're going to have new revenues to help us to ensure that we're able to pay it. I just don't see us not being able to and deciding not to make our payments, or not being able to make our payments to PERS over the next several years. And so what we've done so far, and what we will continue to do on the cost containment measure side, is we are, as you know, we're shifting more of the responsibility for pension costs to employees. We've been negotiating that. The miscellaneous employees historically have a cost-sharing plan, have had one in place since 2006, but even our public safety folks now, they're paying 9% of their costs, and we're negotiating even higher contributions to that. So that's one of the things we've been doing. We're also negotiating shorter-term contracts just so we can be more nimble and respond to what may occur in the near future. And then also negotiating salary increases that are within our means. As you know, our budget calls for a 1% increase in salaries, and we've been staying pretty close to that in our negotiations, and that's going to help us long term. And then what the grand jury did not consider and factor into their forecast is the fact that we have new revenues coming in from cannabis taxes. We don't know what the number is going to be, but it could be upwards of $1 million per year when they're all up and running. And we're also going to be getting additional sales taxes from the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision on South Dakota versus Wayfair. That's going to provide more sales tax revenues to us that we're currently not enjoying for those that occur out of state. So the decision said that even if you're out of state doing online sales, if it's being used here in the state of California, we are entitled to those sales taxes. So those two things are going to be providing us additional revenues that will definitely offset those impacts. And then the other thing is that it doesn't recognize, their findings doesn't recognize that 50% of our budget is outside the general fund, and those utility funds particularly, they have a lot more flexibility in being able to not only control costs, but also to generate more revenues to cover those costs. The recommendations that they came up with were two. One was that the city should analyze capital spending, staffing levels, revenues under our control to identify cost savings and revenue gains to address these increasing costs. And our response is, sure. We've been doing that, and we will continue to do that. That's certainly something we agree with. And that the city produce a pension or a public report on its plan for addressing the rising pension costs, and that is our intent. Between now and next spring, as we develop the budget, we are going to be working on developing a plan that speaks to how we, in fact, are going to address the long-term impacts of rising pension costs. So that's something we agree with and have indicated that is our intent. So that's all I really wanted to cover. Like I said, the other findings were we agreed with. They were pretty innocuous. But that's my report.
Thank you for that presentation. Are there any questions of staff? I guess then we just need a motion to accept the report and recommend that council.
Okay, I recommend that council support the proposed response, and then from there we'll be sending a letter to the grand jury and respond with our official responses, assuming council supports that.
Great. Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Oppose and abstain. Matter carries unanimously. Thank you, and we're
Right.
adjourned.
Well, thank you.